Oh, we are so back. That's right, the new championship season is upon us. Heralded by some as the best league in the world, there's no doubt that the championship still maintains some of the authenticity that the Premier League has lost, while still boasting an excellent standard of football, plenty of big crowds, and no dreaded VAR. What's not to like? It is just a shame that the whole thing is built out of sand. Exactly a year ago, I made a video entitled The Stupidest League in World Football, exploring the insanity of the championship, the league's totally unsustainable financial model, and how excessive parachute payments had undermined the once lauded unpredictability at the top end of the division. Well, 12 months on, I am delighted to announce that absolutely nothing has changed. Actually, that's not quite true. It could be argued that things have gotten a little bit worse. The championship as a whole remains technically insolvent, that is to say, the combined debt of the league's 24 clubs is greater than their combined assets. Now, I'm no Warren Buffett, but I'd say that's probably somewhat suboptimal. The average championship club now loses close to £500,000 a week, or roughly £70,000 a day. Following the last set of accounts, if it's more good news that you're after, the rolling losses of championship clubs over the last 10 years exceeded £3 billion for the first time. In that sense then, not much has changed since my last video about the championship. Clubs are still hemorrhaging cash, many of them are on the verge of breaking profit and sustainability rules, and the gap between the championship and the Premier League, both on and off the pitch, continues to grow ever wider. In other ways, however, a great deal has changed. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be making another video. The Championship, and the EFL as a whole, has signed a new TV deal with Sky Sports starting from this season, a new deal with the Premier League in terms of both redistribution and parachute payments, and is currently in the midst of a bitter dispute regarding new profit and sustainability rules, which threatens to break out into a full-scale civil war between clubs, leagues, and English football's newly introduced independent regulator. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to the weirdest, most wonderful, and, certainly, still the stupidest second tier on the planet, as we take a look at the myriad of crises facing the Championship and the league's 24 clubs, the uncomfortable truths that English football still refuses to even acknowledge, let alone confront, and look forward to some of the most pressing questions regarding the season ahead. The Championship is a bit like Jermaine Jackson or Belarus, in that it lives in the shadow of something much larger than itself. In the case of the Championship, that isn't Michael Jackson or Russia, but the Premier League. The biggest and richest league in world football by a country mile, with a financial dominance that becomes greater and greater with every passing season, Premier League clubs now rake in a combined total of more than £6 billion a season in revenue. English football is unique in some ways, in that its top flight is connected to its second tier via promotion and relegation, but administratively, they are two separate companies and governing bodies. That is the whole reason why the Premier League was founded in 1992, splitting from the Football League in a breakaway orchestrated by the league's then Big Five, in cahoots with media barons, so that they could capitalise upon the increased televising of football matches, negotiate their own broadcast deals, and keep all of the revenue for themselves, rather than having to share it with those pesky teams outside of the top flight. The Premier League would credit this breakaway for the enormous economic success of English football's top flight, but it has also made English football jaw-droppingly unequal. In the 2018-19 season, for example, Huddersfield Town, who finished bottom of the Premier League, having won just 16 points all season, received £96 million in central funding. Norwich City, by comparison, who won the Championship title that season, winning 94 points, received just £8 million in central funding. By central funding, just to be clear, what I mean is money that's distributed directly from the central fund of, in Huddersfield's case, the Premier League, and in Norwich's the EFL, which is generated primarily through centrally negotiated rights deals and excludes individually generated matchday or commercial revenue, along with player sales. Just one place separated Huddersfield and Norwich within the English Football League pyramid as they traded places at the end of the season, yet £88 million separated them in terms of central funding. In other words, Huddersfield received exactly 12 times as much. This gap and the consequences of it have long been a subject of great debate and, understandably, grievance on the part of the EFL and its clubs. Until this season, EFL clubs received £130 million in so-called solidarity payments from the Premier League, which is almost exactly the same as they received, £132 million, directly from the EFL Central Reserves, generated via the EFL's own media rights, sponsorships, and various levies. On the face of it, that might sound like a great deal. The Premier League, out of the goodness of its heart, is subsidising the EFL to the tune of 100% of its actual revenue, effectively doubling the amount of money the 72 teams in the EFL receive. This is the Premier League's framing, selling their redistribution as effectively a philanthropic endeavour. In actual fact, the Premier League is of course heavily dependent upon the EFL. A strong English Football League pyramid is pivotal to the Premier League retaining its status as the world's #1 football league. It is where some of the Premier League's best players begin their careers as products of EFL academies or are developed on loan from Premier League clubs, and the Premier League's supposed unique selling point of strength in depth and intense competition throughout the division is dependent on 3 talented teams who are able to compete, winning promotion each season. It also isn't great, just from a PR standpoint, to have a filthy rich top flight with a crumbling heap of minnows struggling to keep the lights on beneath it. So the EFL has some leverage here, and some justification, in its claims of unfairness. Since becoming chairman of the EFL, Rick Parry, who was, incidentally, the first chief executive of the Premier League, has lobbied for the Premier League and EFL rights deals to be combined and for the EFL to receive a 25% split of the revenue. The Premier League claimed that was far too generous and would threaten its competitive advantage, so they made a counteroffer to share 14.75% of their net media rights with the EFL. Parry and the EFL have also lobbied the Premier League to scrap parachute payments, which are worth more than £200 million a season, because they feel that they could be redistributed more fairly between their clubs as a whole. Parachute payments, or sustainability payments, as they have recently been renamed by the Premier League, are widely reviled by EFL clubs and particularly Championship clubs due to the gross financial advantage they afford recently relegated clubs over everyone else, except for those clubs who are in receipt of parachute payments at any given time, who rather enjoy the gross financial advantage that they are afforded over everyone else. For a league that sells itself on its unpredictability, parachute payments have made the Championship promotion race remarkably predictable. Over the last 5 years, over 70% of promotion-winning teams have been in receipt of parachute payments. And the problem, and gap, is only getting bigger and worse. In the last 4 seasons, 7 out of the 8 teams to win automatic promotion from the Championship have been in receipt of parachute payments, with Ipswich Town last season being the sole exception. Ipswich were the only team to prevent all 3 relegated clubs, Leicester, Leeds and Southampton, from running away with things last season, with Leicester winning the league title and Leeds and Southampton meeting in the playoff final. In the 2022-23 season, the 5 teams in receipt of parachute payments had an average revenue of £66 million, exactly 3 times as much, £22 million, as the average revenue of the other 19 teams who didn't benefit from parachute payments. Unsurprisingly, Burnley and Sheffield United, 2 teams benefiting from parachute payments that season, ran away with the automatic promotion places. Since the Premier League's shareholders, which are just the Premier League clubs, would have to vote in favour of removing parachute payments, and about 12 or 13 teams are capable of being relegated either this season or next at any given time, basically, everyone outside of the rich 7 is somewhat at risk, a majority of Premier League clubs are unlikely to ever be in favour of removing a huge safety net following relegation, and a greatly improved chance of making an immediate return. Here too, there has been a compromise of sorts. The Premier League proposed reducing parachute or sustainability payments to relegated clubs to 1.442% of their net media rights in year 1, 1.124% in year 2, and 0.557% in year 3. That may sound very confusing, but it basically works out at about £50 million in year 1, £40 million in year 2, and £20 million in year 3. A slight reduction on the previous scheme, but under the new deal, relegated clubs in receipt of sustainability payments would also be entitled to their share of the Premier League solidarity payments made available to all EFL and Championship clubs, which they weren't previously, bumping up their overall payments to pretty much exactly where they already were. Which is why their proposals were met with little objection from relegation-threatened Premier League clubs. What is good news for them is bad news for everyone else, and it means that the dominance of the recently relegated Premier League teams isn't likely to come to an end anytime soon. Despite their objections, the EFL had little option but to accept the Premier League's new deal, which still represents a significant increase in revenue for EFL, and especially Championship clubs. The Premier League's solidarity payments are divided between Championship, League 1 and League 2 teams on an 80-12-8 split. This season is a transitional season, which will see an immediate £88 million boost to the solidarity pot, with the 2025-26 season set to become the first steady-state season, an ominous title, in which solidarity payments spread out across the EFL by the Premier League will rise to roughly £460 million. On the same 80-12-8 split, that is likely to work out at around £15 million per Championship club. Factor in parachute payments, and the Premier League will be redistributing in excess of £700 million to EFL clubs from next season onwards, an increase of more than £200 million on the previous arrangements, plus a further 0.25% of the Premier League's net media rights, which will be made available exclusively to League 1 and 2 teams, with a 60-40 split, but ring-fenced solely for infrastructure projects. Championship revenue is also increasing this season as a result of the EFL's own broadcast deal with Sky Sports. The EFL's new deal is worth £895 million over the next 5 years, plus £40 million in marketing benefits, which represents a 50% increase over the previous deal. Under the new arrangements, all Championship, League 1 and League 2 midweek fixtures will be broadcast live on Sky in the United Kingdom, replacing Sky's in-house iFollow service. An incredible 1,059 EFL, EFL Cup, and EFL Trophy matches will be broadcast in total, including 328 Championship matches and a minimum of 5 Championship games each weekend. It is good news for clubs whose broadcast revenue in the Championship should increase from between £8 to £10 million a season to roughly £14 million on average, but it is less good for fans. The increased number of televised games means an increased number of games being moved for television, often making it harder for fans to attend. My own club, Hull City, have had 9 of our first 12 games selected for television, with rearranged fixtures including a trip to Stoke City, which is now an 8 o'clock kickoff on a Friday night, instead of 3 PM on a Saturday afternoon, and a home game against Swansea City, which has been moved to a 12:30 kickoff on a Saturday. That means coaches from Swansea will have to set off at 5:30 in the morning at the very latest in order for travelling fans to get there in time for the game. Naturally, especially with the games being broadcast live on television now, what will happen is that some fans just won't attend arduous rearranged fixtures, meaning that, as was forecast, EFL clubs will have to balance a potential loss in matchday revenue against any uptick in broadcast revenue as a result of the new deal. That uplift in revenue this season, and especially next season with the increased Premier League redistribution, helps ease some of the Championship's financial problems, in much the same way as a paracetamol would help ease some of the pain of having your leg bitten off by a shark, but it does nothing to fix the inherent unfairness afforded to the clubs with parachute payments. If anything, it may slightly exacerbate them, which not only makes the Championship less competitive and more predictable, but also encourages non-parachute payment clubs to overspend. I was going to use the verb forces rather than encourages there, but of course, there isn't actually any formal obligation. But any club that wishes to even entertain the prospect of promotion from the Championship without parachute payments has to sustain significant losses. When you look at the teams to have won promotion without parachute payments in recent years, Sheffield United lost £21 million, or an average of £400,000 a week, when they went up under Chris Wilder. Leeds United lost £64 million, or £1.2 million a week, the season that they went up under Marcelo Bielsa, having lost £21 million the season before that. And Nottingham Forest lost £46.2 million the season that they went up via the playoffs, up from £15.5 million the previous season, spending a truly extraordinary 202% of their turnover that season on their wage bill alone. Given that the Championship's allowable loss limit over 3 years was capped at £39 million, had either Leeds or Forest failed to win promotion when they did, they would have been in serious trouble. Even the perceived fairy tale stories, like Brentford, who are maybe the best run club in English football over the last 10 years, still lost £8.5 million the season that they went up, and £9.1 million the season before that, with the lucrative sales of Ollie Watkins and Saeed Benrahma steering them clear of any regulatory trouble, and Luton Town, the Championship's ultimate promotion-winning minnows over the last decade, lost £21 million when they won promotion in the 2022-23 season, spending a massive 150% of their turnover on wages alone. So they just go to show that no one, not even the best run or most unlikely of Championship promotion winners, is capable of doing it without sustaining hefty and, invariably, ultimately unsustainable losses in the long term. Ipswich Town's accounts for the 2023-24 season haven't yet been published, but given that the Tractor Boys lost over £18 million in League One the previous season, and made nothing last season in terms of player sales, it seems safe to assume that they will have been pretty substantial. Of course, in all of those examples, things worked out. They are literally hand-picked examples of the select few clubs who have won promotion in recent years without parachute payments, but it's not as though they are the only clubs to have either spent beyond their means or beyond the acceptable bounds of the league's financial regulations, the vast majority of whom fail to realise their ambition of promotion and unlocking the untold riches of the Premier League. I am talking, of course, about clubs like Derby County, Wigan Athletic, Bolton Wanderers, Reading, Sheffield Wednesday, Queen's Park Rangers, and so on and so forth, all of whom have faced varying financial crises, ranging from PSR breaches and points deductions, all the way to administration and winding up orders. Derby, two-time English champions and former FA Cup winners, very nearly ceased to exist in 2021, having overspent and amassed enormous unpaid debts under the ownership of Mel Morris. So long as the incentive structures remain so warped, and the only viable path to success is by taking a fairly sizable gamble, we will see these kinds of meltdowns repeated. And naturally, exacerbated at clubs with irresponsible and poorly vetted ownership regimes, some of whom should frankly never have been allowed to own clubs. There is a certain degree of irony in the Premier League renaming parachute payments sustainability payments when they play a significant role in making English football so unsustainable. One of the ways of fixing warped incentive structures and curbing the worst excesses of crazy or malevolent owners is regulation, so long as you get it right. The Championship's allowable loss limit over a 3-year rolling period has received a modest uplift this season from £39 to £41.5 million, but a more radical redesign of the league's profit and sustainability regulations is on the horizon. Whereas UEFA, the Premier League, and even Leagues 1 and 2 have all switched or will very soon switch from next season onwards to what is commonly referred to as squad cost control rules, the Championship is almost unique in still having old-school FFP or PSR regulations. I have talked about this at length in the past, but basically, squad cost controls are a more targeted form of regulation designed to make teams more sustainable by restricting expenditure on wages, transfer fees, and agent fees, while encouraging more long-term investments like infrastructure, youth development, and women's football. As with the old system of FFP or PSR, everyone's rules are slightly different. So UEFA will restrict teams competing in their competitions to spending a maximum of 70% of their revenue on wages, transfers and agents fees, whereas the Premier League has settled on a higher cap of 85%. The Premier League also regulated with a lighter touch under the previous profit and sustainability regulations, believing that their revenue is more secure than rival leagues and their clubs are more sustainable and responsible. They are also lobbied, of course, by several of their clubs who want as little regulation on spending as possible, and in some cases, would actually prefer none at all. Yet again, this has created an inflection point. The Championship looks very likely to switch to a squad cost control system of regulation within the next couple of seasons, and the ring-fence spending limit that they plan to impose on clubs will be set at 70%. The Premier League, however, as part of their ongoing negotiations with the EFL, argues that recently relegated Premier League clubs who are in receipt of sustainability payments should be allowed to continue to spend 85% of their revenue on wages, transfers and agents fees, meaning that they would not only continue to have, on average, 3 times as much revenue as everyone else, and more like 4 times in the case of newly relegated clubs, they would also be allowed to spend 15% more of their 300 to 400% larger revenue on their first team squad than everyone else. The EFL has made a counteroffer of 75%, which, even if accepted, which looks unlikely, would still only further the gap between the relegated Premier League clubs and everyone else. There are also calls, both internally and externally, for the EFL's revenue to be distributed much more heavily on a merit-based criteria, as is the case in the Premier League. In the Premier League, a quarter of the league's revenue that is redistributed to clubs is performance-related, with each position in the league table worth roughly an additional £3 million. Another quarter is then distributed based upon how often each team appears on television, although, given that each team has a guaranteed number of televised fixtures, most of that revenue is guaranteed, and the remaining 50% is distributed equally among all 20 teams. The Championship has proposed a more radical performance-related revenue model, whereby a third of the league's redistributed revenue would be based upon league finish, with a 2-1 ratio, meaning that the team that wins the Championship title each season would receive twice as much prize money as the team that finishes last. The Premier League is in favour of the Championship adopting a more aggressive rake system on the basis that it should strengthen the top end of the Championship, creating greater division within the Championship between the top and bottom clubs, as is the case in the Premier League, and, theoretically therefore, narrowing the gap between the top end of the Championship and the bottom of the Premier League. The EFL, who don't appear to be inherently oppositional to the idea, countered it by suggesting that a more aggressive rake in the Premier League itself would also weaken the bottom Premier League teams, thus serving the same purpose of narrowing the gap. But, once again, that idea is a bit of a tough sell to the bottom half Premier League teams who are in no rush to financially handicap themselves. It's easy to paint the Premier League as the bad guys in all of this, principally because they are, and they wield their enormous leverage with relative impunity. But the deeper that you dig into the internal politics of English football, the clearer that it becomes that it is just a sea of self-interest. Not just between the divisions and different governing bodies, all trying to leverage the best deals for themselves, but also between the clubs themselves. Every club and owner has their own set of ambitions, resources, and ideals, and, unsurprisingly, they feel very strongly that the rules should be drawn up to best suit themselves. Newcastle United and Crystal Palace are both in the Premier League, but whereas Newcastle's Saudi overlords would like to see the Premier League regulated about as heavily as food in the United States, where they have effectively legalised poison, so that they could spend their way to the top as Chelsea and Man City did 15 to 20 years ago, Palace feel all clubs should be sustainable, long-term projects built upon solid foundations, and not simply bankrolled by any one entity, individual or state. That's not because the Palace ownership is inherently benevolent, they're not, or because the Newcastle ownership is inherently evil, although they are, it's because they have completely different aims, resources, and ambitions. Newcastle is a minor propaganda wing of the Saudi state and a tool for diversifying the Saudi economy, which is currently almost entirely dependent upon extracting a finite resource from the ground. Palace is an investment by 4 business people who want to see a return on their money. In the Championship, likewise, you have got clubs like Middlesbrough, Hull and Stoke, whose owners would like much more lenient spending regulations, since they would likely be willing to cover intense short-term losses with the aim of winning promotion. But you've also got clubs like Derby, ironically now, Oxford and Plymouth, who would benefit from tighter spending regulations, giving them a better chance at competing. There is also now the added presence of an independent regulator, introduced by the previous government, which was once fiercely opposed by the Premier League, who don't feel as though they should be accountable to anyone other than their shareholders, and actually also by the EFL. The Premier League's position softened once it became clear that no amount of opposition was going to stop the creation of an independent regulator. Meanwhile, the EFL have greatly warmed to the idea, hoping that a government regulator will take their side and give them greater leverage in future negotiations with the Premier League. The 2022-23 season was actually the first since the 2016-17 season in which revenue, as a whole, was greater than wage expenditure in the Championship. The league's 24 teams still lost a combined £316 million because wages aren't their only outgoing, but, it sounded nice when I said it, didn't it? Okay, now forget everything that I just said about the Championship becoming ever more boring and predictable, even though it's true, because, like a problem gambler or someone stuck in an abusive relationship, I'm here to tell you that this time, or this season in this context, could be different. 3 out of the 4 super teams, who looked like Premier League teams in the Championship last season and ran away with things, have been promoted, and the remaining team, Leeds, have been weakened by the losses of Crescencio Somerville, Archie Gray and Glenn Camera. Leeds are still the bookies' favourites to win the league and to win promotion this season, but personally, I would be surprised if they won more than 90 points this season, which was only enough for them to finish 3rd last season. Not amazed, stranger things have happened, but fairly surprised. Likewise, the 3 relegated clubs, Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United, look like Championship teams in the Premier League last season, as they came straight back down, and I don't think any of them are as strong as Leicester, Leeds and Southampton were last season. I still expect all 3 to finish in the top 10, at least 2 out of the 3 to make the top 6, and at least one of them, maybe 2 to win promotion. But I would be surprised if the gap between them and the chasing pack was as large as it was last season. Middlesbrough and Coventry, who missed out on the playoffs last season having been in them the previous term, have both kept the bones of a decent squad together while strengthening in key areas under highly capable coaches. Meanwhile, my club, Hull City, who finished 7th last season, can barely field a starting 11 at this moment in time, and will have replaced over half of our squad by the time that the transfer window slams shut, as well as having a change of manager and most of our backroom staff, making them, or us, a total unknown quantity. West Brom and Norwich, who finished 5th and 6th last season, losing against Leeds and Southampton in the playoff semi-finals, have both endured difficult summers. Norwich have lost Gabriel Sara, likely soon to be followed by Jonathan Rowe, or, in other words, by far their 2 best players, leaving only Josh Sargent in the way of genuine star quality still remaining. Meanwhile, West Brom have had a mass exodus, which almost rivals Hull's, losing the likes of Cedric Kipre, OK Yakuzlu, Connor Townsend, Brandon Thomas Asante and Nathaniel Chalabar, with little in the way of replacements. Both will need to strengthen before the window shuts, and most likely avoid injuries to key players like Sargent and Madger if they are to replicate their success from last season. Sunderland, meanwhile, have a talented young squad and have so far managed to keep hold of star man Jack Clarke. It is just a case of whether they will click. Queen's Park Rangers and Sheffield Wednesday were resurgent following a change of management last season, but whether they can maintain those standards over a full season is an entirely different question, and Cardiff City have been very active in the transfer market, but the jury is still out as to whether Errol Bullitt can turn an eclectic bunch of players into a competitive squad. Even among the promoted clubs, Derby and Portsmouth are former champions of England, meanwhile Oxford United are genuine minnows, competing in the second tier for the first time since the 1990s, and they will have by far the lowest budget in the division. But, as I am recording this final segment, they have just won their opening game of the season 2-0 against last season playoff semi-finalist Norwich City. So, the Championship is probably the most interesting, boring division in the world. Forget Jermaine Jackson and Belarus then, the Championship is like crystal meth. Addictive, enthralling, but largely the preserve of people who are incredibly fiscally irresponsible and often wind up in dark holes, unable to find a way out. Or, so I imagine. I've never actually done crystal meth. On that note, that's it for today's video. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I obviously hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Not specifically on crystal meth, mainly on the other stuff. And of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, where I just uploaded the third video. It is all about Georgia's journey at their first ever major tournament, which was the Euros just gone. I think it's quite good, so, feel free to check it out and subscribe. Both of those should be on your screens now, along with a couple of videos, including that one, that you might want to watch. And, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all three. And all of those links, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers.